Breaking news that just escalated the trade war, threatening North America's food security. As President Trump's tariffs continue crushing Canadian agricultural exports worth up to $22 billion annually, sources inside both governments confirm that Washington has reached out to Ottawa requesting emergency agricultural cooperation, specifically on wheat and grain supplies. But here's where this story takes a stunning turn. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response isn't what anyone expected. Instead of jumping at the opportunity to restore trade with America's largest trading partner, Carney just announced Canada is doubling down on its pivot to China, signing agricultural deals that could lock American buyers out of Canadian grain markets for years to come. How did we get here? What does this mean for American consumers facing food price inflation? And why are supply chain experts warning this could trigger the worst disruption to North American food systems in modern history? Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal shows three catastrophic failures that are reshaping global agriculture forever. Here's what just unfolded over the past several hours. According to multiple sources, including analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies and reporting from trade policy insiders, the Trump administration has been quietly reaching out to Canada through back channels, seeking to negotiate exemptions or reductions in agricultural tariffs that have crippled cross-border food trade. The numbers are staggering. Trump's tariffs, imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, have hit Canadian agricultural exports, with levies ranging from 25 to 35%. We're talking about $18 to $22 billion worth of annual agricultural trade, suddenly facing massive barriers. Canadian wheat, which Americans depend on for everything from bread to pasta, is caught in the crossfire. Canada exported 57.4 million tons of grain in the most recent crop year, with the United States historically being a major destination for Canadian wheat, canola, and other agricultural products. But here's the critical context that changes everything. Prime Minister Carney stood in Beijing alongside President Xi Jinping and announced a sweeping agricultural trade deal. China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% down to 15%. China also removed its 100% tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crab, and peas. In exchange, Canada opened its markets to Chinese electric vehicles and committed to dramatically increasing agricultural exports to China. And it gets worse. Carney publicly stated that China has become a more predictable partner than the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. Pause. A Canadian Prime Minister just declared that Communist China, a country that arbitrarily detained Canadian citizens for over 1,000 days, is now more reliable than democratic America. The human impact here is already visible. Meet Jennifer Patterson, a third-generation wheat farmer from North Dakota. Her family's operation has bought Canadian wheat for processing and export for 40 years. She told reporters recently that her costs have jumped 30% since the tariffs hit, and she's now scrambling to find alternative suppliers from Australia and Argentina, paying premium prices that are crushing her margins. "We're watching decades of cross-border cooperation just evaporate," she said. And nobody in Washington seems to understand that you can't just rebuild these supply chains overnight. Let's break down the mechanics of what's happening here and why this represents a fundamental rupture in North American agricultural integration. First, understand the scale of agricultural interdependence. The United States, Canada, and Mexico have spent 3 decades building the most integrated agricultural market in the world under NAFTA and then the USMCA. Canadian farmers planted 40 million tons of wheat recently, including 29.3 million tons of spring wheat. Historically, significant portions move seamlessly across the US-Canada border for processing, blending, and export. American grain elevators, mills, and food processors are optimized for this Canadian supply. You can't just flip a switch and replace it. But here's the kicker. Trump's tariff strategy, which uses the IEEPA to claim that trade deficits and drug trafficking constitute national emergencies, has created legal and economic chaos. Federal courts have already struck down some IEEPA-based tariffs, with cases now on appeal. This legal uncertainty means businesses don't know if current tariff rates will hold, increase, or disappear. Nobody is making long-term investment decisions in that environment. Compare this to a historical precedent that should terrify everyone. Decades ago, the US-Soviet grain embargo devastated American farmers because the Soviets simply found new suppliers. It took American agriculture years to rebuild those markets, and some customer relationships never recovered. We're watching history repeat itself, except this time America is the one imposing restrictions on its own neighbors, and those neighbors are actively pivoting to China. China is now positioned to become the dominant buyer of Canadian agricultural products. According to trade data, China has been the largest importer of Canadian wheat over the past 5 years, taking approximately 10% of Canadian wheat exports. Under Carney's new strategy, Canada is targeting a doubling of non-US exports from roughly $125 billion to $250 billion. Canadian agricultural exports to China, currently worth approximately $32 billion annually, make up roughly 25% of that target. Carney explicitly stated his goal: reduce dependence on the unpredictable American market by locking in long-term deals with China and other Asian buyers. Think about what this really means through a simple analogy. Imagine you're a long-time customer at a local bakery. You've been buying bread there for 30 years. Then one day you start demanding the baker give you discounts, threatening to stop buying unless they meet impossible conditions, and publicly questioning whether you even need their bread. The baker eventually finds a new customer willing to pay premium prices and sign long-term contracts. When you finally decide you need that bread again, guess what? The baker has moved on. That's exactly what's happening in agricultural markets right now. Now let's examine the supply chain mechanics. North American grain supply chains are incredibly complex networks involving cross-border movements, storage facilities, rail logistics, port capacity, and processing plants. Canadian wheat moves through American ports for export. American grain blends with Canadian varieties to meet specific buyer requirements. When you insert 25 to 35% tariffs into this system, the whole thing seizes up. Railway companies like CN Rail, which reported record grain volumes during the most recent crop year, are now facing uncertainty about future shipments. Port facilities in Seattle, Portland, and other Pacific Northwest locations that depend on Canadian grain flows are seeing reduced volumes. Elevator operators are sitting on excess capacity. Processing plants are running below optimal levels. Every link in the chain is experiencing disruption. And here's the data that should alarm every American consumer. According to the USDA, wheat prices have already jumped 12% since tariffs were imposed. Food manufacturers are passing those costs directly to consumers. The average American family spends approximately $8,000 annually on food. A sustained increase in grain prices translates directly to higher costs for bread, pasta, cereal, baked goods, and hundreds of other products. But the long-term implications are even more concerning. Canadian farmers are making planting decisions right now based on who they expect to buy their crops in coming years. If Chinese buyers are offering premium prices and long-term contracts while American buyers are tangled in tariff uncertainty, where do you think those farmers are going to direct their production? Once those trade relationships solidify, once Chinese food processors become dependent on Canadian supply, once logistics networks reorient toward Pacific shipping routes, reversing that shift becomes exponentially harder. Experts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies warn that the upcoming USMCA review will be a defining moment. Canada's supply management system for dairy, agricultural rules of origin, and the entire framework for North American food security hangs in the balance. Carney has already signaled that Canada's old relationship with the United States, based on steadily increased integration, is over. He's negotiating from a position where diversification away from American markets isn't just a threat, it's active policy. Let's break down exactly who gets hurt when North American agricultural supply chains fracture, because the ripple effects are hitting multiple sectors simultaneously. American workers and families are facing immediate price pressure. Food inflation, which had finally started moderating, is accelerating again. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that grain-based products saw a 12% price increase in the first weeks following tariff implementation. For a family of 4, that translates to roughly $960 annually in additional food costs, assuming the price increases don't accelerate further. But it's not just consumers. American farmers who depend on Canadian inputs are getting crushed. Wheat growers in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota have historically blended their crops with Canadian varieties to meet export specifications. Those relationships are now disrupted, forcing farmers to seek alternative suppliers or accept lower prices for crops that don't meet buyer requirements. Small businesses throughout the agricultural supply chain face existential threats. Consider the case of Heartland Mills, a family-owned grain processing operation in Kansas. This company has been buying Canadian spring wheat for blending and export for 3 generations. The owner, speaking on condition of anonymity due to fear of regulatory retaliation, told trade publications that tariffs have increased their raw material costs by 28%. They can't pass all those costs to customers without losing contracts to foreign competitors. Their options are to absorb losses, which threatens bankruptcy, or shut down operations and lay off 140 workers in a rural community where alternative employment barely exists. Trucking companies that specialize in cross-border agricultural transport are seeing volumes drop by 40 to 60%. These aren't large corporations with diversified revenue streams. These are small operators with 5 to 10 trucks, usually family businesses that have been running the same routes for decades. When volumes collapse, they can't pivot to other freight. They go bankrupt, and those specialized logistics capabilities disappear from the supply chain. Large corporations are making strategic decisions that will reshape North American agriculture for decades. Cargill, ADM, and other grain trading giants are quietly shifting procurement strategies to reduce dependence on cross-border North American flows. According to industry analysts, these companies are increasing purchases from South American suppliers, even though transportation costs are higher. Because regulatory certainty matters more than marginal cost savings. When the world's largest agricultural traders reduce their exposure to North American integration, investment in processing facilities, storage infrastructure, and logistics capacity follows. Stock market reactions reflect this uncertainty. Agricultural equipment manufacturers like John Deere have seen share prices decline as investors question future demand for equipment. If North American planting shifts toward crops that don't require cross-border supply chains, fertilizer companies dependent on cross-border distribution networks are experiencing similar pressure. International partners are watching this collapse with a mix of alarm and opportunity. The European Union, which has its own agricultural trade tensions with both the United States and Canada, is now positioning itself as a stable alternative supplier for both markets. Australian wheat exporters are aggressively marketing to American buyers, emphasizing reliability and freedom from tariff uncertainty. Argentina, despite its own economic challenges, is expanding grain production capacity specifically to capture market share from disrupted North American supplies. China is the clear strategic winner. Beijing is achieving through Canadian agricultural deals what it couldn't accomplish through direct confrontation with the United States. Chinese food security, a top priority for the Communist Party, is being enhanced through long-term contracts with Canadian suppliers. Chinese negotiators are leveraging Canadian desperation for non-American markets to secure favorable terms that lock in supply for years. Trade policy experts are issuing stark warnings. Dr. Maria Stephan, a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, stated that North American agricultural disintegration represents a self-inflicted wound that will take a generation to heal. We're watching the United States voluntarily surrender one of its greatest strategic advantages, control over the world's most productive and integrated agricultural region. The expert response to this agricultural breakdown has been swift and deeply concerned. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who oversees Canada's largest agricultural province, called the situation a crisis entirely of Washington's making. He warned that American consumers will pay the price for these reckless tariff policies in the form of higher food costs and reduced access to products they've depended on for generations. Agricultural economists at major universities are modeling the long-term impacts. Research from the University of California, Davis projects that if current trade disruptions persist for more than 18 months, structural changes in North American agricultural supply chains will become permanent. Farmers make multi-year decisions about land use, equipment purchases, and crop selection. Once those decisions tip toward non-integrated markets, reversing them requires massive capital investment and years of relationship rebuilding. The legal implications under USMCA are creating additional uncertainty. Article 34.7 of the agreement requires a formal review. That review was supposed to be a routine assessment of implementation. Instead, it's now shaping up to be a high-stakes renegotiation where agricultural access will be a central battleground. Canada has made clear it will demand guaranteed market access and an end to arbitrary tariff impositions as conditions for extending the agreement. If those demands aren't met, Canada has explicitly stated it will pursue annual reviews, creating permanent uncertainty that will drive investment and trade away from North American integration. Political reactions in Washington are mixed. Congressional Republicans from agricultural states are quietly expressing concern that tariff policies are harming their constituents, but few are willing to publicly challenge the Trump administration. Democrats are using the situation to argue that the president's trade strategy lacks coherence and is damaging American economic interests. But neither party has presented a concrete plan to reverse the agricultural supply chain damage already underway. In the short term, over the next several weeks, watch for three critical developments. First, whether the Trump administration offers meaningful tariff relief on agricultural products as part of broader USMCA negotiations. Second, whether Canadian farmers begin locking in long-term contracts with Chinese buyers, which would cement the trade reorientation. Third, whether American food manufacturers and retailers start warning consumers about impending price increases, which could create political pressure for policy changes. Medium-term scenarios, looking out several months, involve the actual restructuring of supply chains. If current policies persist, we'll see permanent closure of cross-border agricultural processing facilities, shutdown of specialized logistics operations, and reallocation of Canadian farmland toward crops destined for Asian markets rather than American buyers. Canadian wheat production could shift from varieties Americans prefer toward types Chinese buyers demand, making future reintegration even harder. The most alarming long-term consequence is food security vulnerability. North America has enjoyed unparalleled food security for decades because of integrated agricultural production. That integration is fracturing in real time, and nobody in a position of authority seems to fully grasp the strategic implications. Let's recap the three most critical points here. First, Trump's agricultural tariffs have triggered Canadian retaliation and strategic pivot to China, with deals signed that could lock American buyers out of Canadian grain markets for years. Second, this disruption is hitting American consumers directly, with food price inflation already accelerating to 12% for grain-based products, costing families nearly $1,000 annually. Third, the breakdown of North American agricultural integration represents a self-inflicted strategic disaster.